focus on this idea of measuring success, key metrics for evaluating process improvement initiatives. That's a lot of big words in one sentence. And what Kaho and I are going to try and do today is to sort of break that down and make it a bit more understandable and maybe a bit more what I might call layman's terms. But really, it's about this idea of when we improve things, how do we actually know that what we've done is better? How do we make sure we're not making it worse? How do we make sure we're not just confusing people? How do we make sure that all the time and effort that we put into our work on wanting to be able to make our processes better actually does what we're hoping for it to do? Kaho, anything you want to say before we start this morning?
No, I think that's a great start with it. I think that there's when a lot of times when businesses get into process improvement, it's seen as extra work. They're not always aligned. So when you go work with a new team and they're trying to do some of these process improvement initiatives, if they do not align with the business initiatives, then you get into this situation where people will try to do this work and then they don't really measure it in a meaningful way. They're seeing as two different streams of work. We have the business work and then we have the improvement work. And I think this is where, when we have this discussion with it, is that if you can get the two of them to align, then it makes it much more efficient. It makes it much easier to measure, as opposed to, okay, these are the things I need to measure to run my business. These are the things I need to measure for improvement work. When they're not aligned like this, it makes it very difficult to get the people to engage and to measure and to understand what you're measuring.
And it's when we get into that, oh no, here they come again, flavor of the month kind of thing, right? When it's seen to be something separate. So let's dig into that idea of alignment. How do we actually do that? I mean, it all makes sense, what you shared, but how do we actually make sure that there is that alignment between what we're trying to improve and overall what our business is trying to achieve?
I think the first step that we have to do to make sure we know is awareness of what our business objectives are. We need to be aware of what is it that we want to do as a business. You may not have it for 5 years, but you should at least have it for the next year. Because with that, then you can break down, okay, what do we need to do this quarter? What do we need to do this month? What do we need to do this week? And then you can just piece it down so it's something that's more tangible and manageable. So when you don't know what you're trying to achieve as a business, it's very difficult to measure what success looks like. So ideally, you can have a 5-year plan or a 3-year plan, and then you can say, okay, what is it that I need to do this year to achieve that goal? But it's sometimes very difficult to see 5 years in the future. So at least try to get 1 or 2 years to say, what is it that we want to achieve, and how do I measure to know that this is successful or not? So I think you just need to be awareness, number one, on what is it that your business wants to achieve. And then once you have identified that, then we can start to do some quantification in regards to that.
And, it sounds like really just what we should be doing from a good business perspective, right? But I know that people get so focused working in their business that they don't take the time, as you're suggesting, to work on their business, right? That 1 year, 3 year, 5 year plan. What's that quote? If you don't know where you're going, any path will get you there. It's kind of like mass confusion, right? I can wander wherever I want because I don't really know what my final destination is. And I think if your staff don't have that picture, you've got multiple different journeys going on at the same time. And I think COVID probably taught a lot of businesses a lot about planning in general, but also about the way in which they business plan, the way in which they are able to. Some people talk about rolling plans now versus a 1 year, 3 year, 5 year. It's a rolling plan. Do you have any thoughts about that idea of sort of rolling it now, given all the different challenges we have?
Well, I think the rolling plan works well, but I think one of the issues that you have with the rolling plans is focus. Because when you're looking at something like key metrics or key business objectives, they should be things that are not changing every single month. So they should be something where you can adjust to see what you're kind of doing. So I think that you need to have agility so that you can have this rolling plan and where you can adjust. But your end goal should be somewhat the same, because you shouldn't be changing your business objectives so frequently at the pace that you're changing month to month. So the way that you get to your business objective, I think, may change a bit. But those are some of the metrics that you may alter that you're measuring on a quarterly or monthly basis. But the vision of what your company is trying to achieve, I think you would want to have that stable and just have the agility to change some of the work that you're going, depending on the climate, the culture of your company, market movement. So in those situations, you have to be adaptable. You have that agility to modify. But I think that you still need to have some sort of a guiding principle so you know what the direction. You can't be swerving every month, reacting to all the different situations.
Yeah, the bright and shiny object, right? Oh, look out! If it was printed in Harvard Business Review this month, we're going to end up going there, and that doesn't help with the stability. Absolutely.
Well, that's a key thing. When I've been working with some companies in the past, when people do not understand how to look at metrics or how to look at data, it's very, very reactive. So you have this small market trend that kind of moves, and then you're reacting to it. And then in this situation, if you're being so reactive, you're probably not looking at the right metric in regards to that. So we can get into discussion afterwards about like what metrics we should look at, but you should not be reacting from one data point. And I think that's the fear that I have when you're trying to align your business objectives. And if you're going to do something with the floating, it's like, do you know where your North Star is? Do you know what the guiding principle is? Because if you do, then you can be kind of mosey on towards there if you're going to reach that point. But I think this is where it's key to understand what is it we're trying to measure and what does success look like.
Yeah, I think for some people they'll nod their heads when you're talking about key performance metrics or data. They'll nod their heads, but there's that math anxiety or data. What's it called? Data dread, math anxiety and data dread, where people will nod their heads, but they're really kind of afraid of the numbers. And so, how do you help to determine those key metrics with a particular project so that people aren't afraid of it? How do you do that?
I think that once you understand what the objectives are, you identify what you want to achieve. In this instance, we have to understand what are the stakeholder needs. You need to review this and kind of just brainstorm them. So what is important to the stakeholders? And I think this is where the data can get very confusing. So generally, when I approach something like this, the first question I want to ask people is like, what question do you want answered from your data? Because then we can present the data accordingly with it. But if you don't understand what is it that's important to you, then it's very difficult to see what's the metric you want to kind of look at. Or people will kind of get off on the tangent and look at a metric that may not necessarily tell the story that you want to. So a lot of times with the way that data is structured is that they look at all this data and then they just kind of provide it with you. But you need to understand what is the problem you're trying to solve? What's the story that you want to tell? How does this report, or how do these key metrics go towards the story with it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you mentioned stakeholders, how do you figure out who those are and how do you involve them then?
I think the way that you need to involve them, I think, is you have to have this conversation throughout the whole thing. When you're trying to determine what your business objectives are, you need to get everyone into the room because you can't have 20 or 30 different business objectives. Because with a large corporation or large business, everyone is going to want to have a say. And I think the issue is with the key performance indicators is that you're going to have too many of them. You're going to have too many business objectives. So you need to make sure that all the stakeholders are aligned and know, okay, what is it that we're trying to achieve with the business? How do I contribute to that success? So what is it that I can do that can drive towards that? And I think this is where you have to have this conversation, this catch ball, to understand, okay, what is it? Are we aware of what our business wants to do? Are we aware of how I contribute to this? How we identify what is my role in achieving this goal? And a lot of the things is we just have to have really good communication channels, and it has to be a two-way conversation where it goes all the way down to the frontline workers who are doing the work, all the way up to the C-level suite who are developing the strategy. So in a situation like this, we have the strategy that comes down from C-level or from the higher senior leadership. But then when problems or things arise, we have to be able to adapt to it. So this is where it's very important to understand, have alignment from top to bottom. What is it that we're merging? How does my role contribute to this? So I think this is where it's very important that we kind of take a look at this and we have alignment. And I think the biggest thing with alignment is we just need to make sure that our communication is crystal clear and we reinforce communication and everyone is aware of how they contribute to the business objectives.
Yeah, there's a lot of gems in what you just said. That idea around how do I contribute, and people seeing the value, both seeing the value that they bring to the conversation, but also seeing the value of the conversation. So the value of being able to engage in that, You talked about alignment, and in my experience, having that alignment as early on as you can, so that you're not, you all think you're going down the same path, but this group over here actually thinks it looks like this, and this group over here thinks it looks like that. It's like that image of the elephant, right? People describe the elephant from different sides, and they see different things, and you don't want to start off that way. And nobody likes to be done to either, right? We all like to be done with. And I think about experiences that I've had where we've brought in, the person who touches and experiences that process every day, maybe the person who's responsible for that process, but maybe for the person that process is applied to as well. So, in healthcare, we often involve patients as an example, and how there'll be a level of conversation. They'll say, oh yeah, that process looks like this. It goes from A to B. And the frontline person says, well, actually, it goes from A to B, and then sometimes over to C, and then sometimes back to A, and sometimes over to C. And, the higher up you go, sometimes the better you understand the theory, but the less you understand how it actually works after a holiday weekend, or when everybody's on vacation, or when suddenly we're all working remotely, or, all of the challenges that we've experienced in the last little while. So we get all this input from all these stakeholders, all these people, we engage them, they get excited, we get alignment. How do we then take all that and figure out the key metrics? What is it that actually is going to tell us that what we're doing is making a difference?
So I'm going to go back to your elephant analogy and just explain, just kind of give an example, and then tie it into the key metrics and how it makes sense. One of the companies I had worked with in the past, we were working with physicians, and we're trying to improve patient flow. So each of the different groups in different departments, they had certain metrics that they wanted to measure. So these were metrics that are important to them. And since they're kind of competing against it, where they're trying to get people to move out, they were trying to determine, okay, what is it that's important to me, without really understanding what the impact is on someone else. Mm-hmm. So we did the tabletop exercise so that we could see how everything ties together. And when you can't see the big picture, you may not understand how your metric may influence someone else's metric. Mm-hmm. So you may be trying to get your time in your unit down, but then pushing them to another unit. But then that causes a chain reaction where then people are exiting faster than they should be, or whatnot. And then they basically, they're coming back into the ER at a faster rate or whatnot. So one of the things when we're looking at these key metrics is like we said before, is we need to review these with all the stakeholders involved. We need to understand what's the business objectives. We need to know how does our part play within it. And when we're doing this, I think that we need to understand different aspects of different metrics, because there's things like where they're leading metric or they're lagging metric. So are we looking at something where we're looking at the process itself, or is this an outcome that we're trying to impact? And generally in these situations, your lagging metric may be someone's leading metric. So with this cascading effect here, we need to understand, how does your metric impact someone else's? How does what you do impact someone else? So this is where it's very important that you have alignment from top down and you have everyone together, and the communication, I think, is the big key with this. And in these situations, we have to evaluate and prioritize what is it that we want to do, because we may not necessarily be able to fix all the metrics or the whole process at once. Generally, in a situation like this, you may want to fix something upstream at the beginning of the process, because then they'll have a trickle-down effect. But there may be some instances where there's a quick win that's further down in the process, and you're going to solve that because it's just a big issue. And you're going to kind of jump into that. But you need to understand, like, what are the things that come into this that are impacted? What are the things that come out of this are kind of impacted? And then we have to say, okay, how are we going to define what success like? How are we going to monitor progression with this? Because once we touch that and we move on to something else, it may have another impact. So I think a lot of the things with the key metrics is we have to understand, like, what is it we're measuring? Why are we measuring it? What question do we want to answer by this? So when we're looking at this metric, is it something that we can impact? If so, then that would be a leading metric. If it's just an outcome that we're going to see, okay, then we have to understand what is it that we need to do as a group and to kind of get this outcome. Mm-hmm. So I think when we're looking at metrics, a lot of this is we have to just simplify so it's something that everyone can understand, and it's not something where it's difficult. So it's not a piece of data that is only reserved for specialists to understand it. So in my point of view, with the background in data, if if you have to explain what story your data is telling or what the key metric is doing, it's too complex.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at this metric, if you can answer what question am I solving by looking at this, then you have a very solid metric, and you have alignment by the whole group then.
Yeah, that's a great tip. You use the term leading and lagging metrics. Can you maybe with an example just quickly define for people who might not be familiar with those terms?
So I think with the lagging is basically what the outcome is, so what you're trying to achieve. So I'll give an example from a manufacturing kind of thing. So if you're trying to say you want to box a product, how many boxes you achieve at the end of the day, that would be your lagging metric, because you're going to take a look at that. At the end of the day, we packaged 40 or 50 boxes. So at the leading metric, is thinking, well, how fast can one worker pack a box? That's your leading metric. So if you see that a worker is taking 5 minutes to pack a box and you want them at 2, then that's something you can achieve. So what can we do to impact this outcome of having 50 boxes packed at the end of the day? So we can influence this. So we can say, okay, how do we optimize the workflow so that this worker can pack boxes more efficiently or better? Do we have to bring more workers? Do we have to change the way they're doing? So that's a leading metric to the outcome of how many boxes we have packed at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. So it's something that you can influence directly, and then that can kind of be a thing. So it's like, how do you impact the process as opposed to what's the outcome of the process? So the outcome of the process will be your lagging, and then within the process is what your leading indicator would be.
And like you, I've had some experience in healthcare, and I know that some of the, quite often we look at something, I call it a balancing measure. I know there's other terminology for it, but there's also being aware of the unintended consequences of what you're doing. So, to follow your boxing example for a minute, what you might want to, a balancing measure, just a bit facetious, but to follow the example for a moment might be, worker injury due to the speed at which they are assembling boxes or whatever the case may be. We're always wanting to watch for those unintended consequences. It's that kind of up to your, what in alligators when you were just trying to drain the swamp kind of thing, is that sometimes, and you mentioned it as well, pushing weights. Sometimes we can fix something in one area, but you just push the wait time to somebody else. It doesn't really address the problem. And so, paying attention to those unintended negative consequences is another factor. Yeah.
I think that's a great example, because if you increase speed, quality is going to be impacted with it. So I've done this with some packaging and manufacturing for products. They were going at a faster rate, but then their margin of error actually increased. But it was so stringent to begin with, it wasn't that big of a deal. So what ended up happening was they were increasing the product that was given away by about $100 over the course of the day. But each of the products were being sold for $1,000. So they basically increased that they could package like 15 more boxes as opposed to what they were doing. So that 15 extra boxes is the revenue generated from the 15 extra boxes offset that $100 of quality that you basically lose out for that day. So you have to determine, like, what is it that you're willing to give up? And I think you're right. You have to balance those between speed and quality in those instances.
But that's a great example of how, if you aren't measuring that data, you might just think, oh, look what we're doing. Isn't this great? Right. And yeah. And without clearly being able to link that back to the problem you're trying to solve or the improvement you're trying to make. Yeah. So are there some specific key performance measures? Are there some things that you see, obviously made specific to the process under review, but are there some things that we typically look at or at least review when we're thinking about choosing measures?
I think if you're looking at process improvement, there's some generic ones that you can take a look at the high level and then kind of just move on from there. So some of them would be like cost reduction for finance, increasing revenue, decreasing expenses. In terms of people, or for some product lines, it's like time savings. So how much time has been saved? We discuss quality improvement with this. So like, how many defects are we seeing in this product? How many times do we have to do rework? How many errors? How many customer complaints with it? For productivity, how many units have we increased with it? For if you're doing with the customer base, what's the customer satisfaction? How many complaints are we getting? How many good reviews are we doing? Are we getting this feedback with the customer? there's instances where I know in the past where I've worked with a company and they were releasing this product, but then it was slightly off of what the standard that the company had wanted. So there was like, it wasn't to their specification.
Mhm.
And the problem was is that it was actually over spec to what the company wanted. It wasn't, it was basically creating more work for the company because it was over spec to them. So they had to kind of degrade it slightly with it so that they could work within the machines. So they had to add like filler into it to make it like workable. So in an
Mhm.
instance like that, they didn't actually talk well. The company, the customer actually reached out to the company and said, okay, like this is fantastic with your product and it's like really, really high quality. But then they realized there's much more effort. And to get to that level of accuracy was actually way more work. So once the company said, okay, we want it slightly less, it would benefit both parties. So it's less work for the customer and there's less work for the team that's producing it. So if they didn't have this discussion with the customers, and so like with this, then this is something that would come out. So even if you are having success with the customer, if you understand what they're trying to do with it, and you know what they're trying to achieve, you can have these conversations. So that's something with customer satisfaction that you can measure. If it's something that you're doing improvement internally with like change management or transformation, I think it's really important to talk with your employees about satisfaction. And then there's things with retainment. I think with the way things are going now, with mental health is super important in the workforce. You have to make sure that your team and your employees are in a very safe mental space at the workplace and at home. You can't necessarily impact what they do at home. So try to make sure that you have the psychological safety from at work. So understand where are they with employee satisfaction engagement at work. There are things as well where we can take a look at the efficiency and effectiveness. So we had touched upon this as well, is that when you're doing the improvement work, it might be super effective, but if it's really inefficient to do it, is it something that's actually going to be sustainable? So
Mhm.
we need to make sure that we're looking at things like this, is that there's certain things that you can measure where if you want that quality, it's fantastic, but is it efficient to do that quality, or can you do it so that's just good enough? So I
Mhm.
think when we're measuring KPIs, there are things that we want to look at. And there's certain things like that are simple, like return on investment, that might be fairly simple. But then you have to look at effectiveness and efficiency. So we got the ROI, but is it efficient the way that we got to it?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, it's interesting. I can think of examples in the media right now that are pretty topical around, efficiency and effectiveness. I think about there's a lot of chatter about self-checkouts as an example, right? And there's a lot of chatter about grocery stores and they put in the self-checkouts, but now all of a sudden they're checking everybody's receipts. So although it seemed, efficient to be able to enable people to check their own groceries out if that's what they want to do, there's some consumer backlash. There's some comment, in many different online social media groups about whether or not they feel that they really should be expected to check out their own groceries. And now this question around, but now you've added a person back into that process because they're checking receipts. So I can see that interplay between efficiency and effectiveness. And it also tells me that as a consumer, when I get those follow-up surveys, when I get the opportunity to feedback, I should take that opportunity because I can input data from a very different perspective than perhaps that business is able to gather internally. So it kind of puts me in a role of understanding how much my data can help to influence that as well.
See, I have a background in research, so I know how difficult it is to get replies back from the survey. So whenever I get a customer survey or any of those, I
Me
always
too.
respond. When I get the phone calls, I will respond and try to help them out with it because I understand like the metrics. If you're looking at customer satisfaction or response rate, if you get 40%, that's fantastic. So
Yeah.
I try to always do that because I've been on the other side. I know what the metric is and I know how diluted it is. But then I know that sometimes I can skew the results. But like that's something that's like I know that's a metric that's very important is response rate. And then if people do not respond, if customers do not respond, they will stop giving out these surveys. You will stop having the
Mhm.
opportunity to voice your opinion.
Yeah.
So I know what the metric is. I understand how the metric is used further down the chain. So that's something that I know that I always do because if we don't respond as customers to when people are asking for our opinion, people are just going to stop asking for your opinion, and then you will not be able to influence change. So I
Yeah.
think this is where it's very key to understand, like, how do you evaluate this? And as a consumer, I know that this is super important to them. So I know that this is a key metric that's tracked, and then I'll make sure that I contribute to it.
It's and I always feel for those, students that are doing research projects as well. I answer all those surveys too, right? The data is important and it makes a difference. So there's, you've really been able to describe the pieces of this and to describe the steps and describe the importance of doing a really thorough job of this. But it sounds like a lot of work. Like if a company were thinking about embarking on this, really starting to dig into this, what would your advice be? Is this something that you'd say, like, just do it on your own? Or is this something that you look for outside expertise for?
I think this depends on the maturity of your team internally and to see whether you can kind of do it. So what an external group can help you do is they'll be unbiased, and then they can help you look at it and help you steer the conversations toward what's your business objective. I think number one that you need to be is what you need to have awareness of what are you trying to do as a business. So you may have some difficulties internally with the team if you have someone facilitating, because there are going to be internal biases with that. So if you have a strong facilitator that can balance and get everyone to talk together, you can do it internally. But in an instance where everyone has a strong opinion and they want to be involved with it, then having a third-party external group come in can be very beneficial to get you that awareness, so that you can identify this is the problem that we're trying to solve. So I think it's really dependent upon the group, but like at the simplest measure, what you have to be able to get to is like, do you have one business objective that everyone agrees that we have to do this? If you can get that and you understand what is it that we're going to have for deliverable, how do we measure that? If you can get that on your own, then by all means do it. But if you can't get that, where you can't have that conversation, and everyone has a different idea, this is when I think it's good to have a third party facilitator come in, because they have no bias, they have no ulterior motives on trying to measure something. So
Mhm.
when we did this with physicians, it's very beneficial, because then when they can see the bigger picture, because we were external, and then we can get them to see it. For
Mhm.
some of the different companies I've worked with, when there's a lot of system issues and then there's 3 or 4 parties involved, having someone internal, they always thought there's some sort of bias. So when having a third party in there, then it's fine. So I think it's really dependent upon the size of the company and what you're trying to achieve. If you have a small group, you may be able to do it just on your own and say, okay, this is what we're going to measure. Everyone agrees to it. You may need some assistance with the process. And then once you learn it, it comes very common sense with you. But I
Mhm.
think it's like you have to understand you're going to struggle with this. There's going to be a couple of times where it's going to be growing pains. So if you
Mhm.
want to do it rapidly, it's much more beneficial to have a third party come in and teach you the errors that they did. If you have
Mhm.
time and you're patient and you want to grow, then you can say, okay, we'll try this, and we know we're going to make errors, and we're going to fix up errors as we go. So I think it just depends on what kind of approach you want to take to it.
Mhm. But that awareness and alignment piece at the beginning, it sounds incredibly important to the process. And I take your point about having somebody external come in who really, you know, doesn't need to know the ins and outs days to days, but can help people come to a common vision, a common alignment, and really just help to be that neutral third party to engage the conversations as well. I always think too that there's a bit of a level of accountability when there's someone else that's coming in as well, right? There's a meeting plan, there's certain things that we are going to achieve. Somebody's got their eyes and ears on this. So I think that, yeah, there's some advantages to both. We're getting close to our time. Just wondering, any final pieces of advice that you want to give to folks today before we sign off?
I think the biggest advice I would have is you need to understand what's the problem you're trying to solve. So, what is it that you want to do as a business objective? What is it that, if you know what question you want answered, then the metrics is a little bit easier, because then you can take a look at, okay, how do we quantify this? How do we identify exactly what is it that we need to do to achieve that result? So, I think once you know what problem you're trying to solve, then trying to get the metrics to get to that is much, much easier. But the biggest issue with a lot of companies and a lot of people face is trying to articulate that problem statement or that business objective into a clear, concise uh, one sentence statement. And I think
Mhm.
once you can get that part down, then the metrics will be much easier to get to.
Yeah, there's that famous quote about if I had 100 days to solve a problem, I'd spend 90 of them making sure I clearly understood the problem. I probably got the numbers wrong, but basically that focus on defining the problem is incredibly important. Yeah. So thanks, Kyle, for being here today. Thanks for sharing your wisdom and your examples. Appreciate everybody who joined us today to hopefully gain some information on this, hopefully begin to think about next directions in terms of your own process improvement initiatives. And hope everybody enjoys a great rest